Despite the many sectarian differences between the numerous sects of Tibetan Buddhism, all Tibetans alike unite in holding Jetsam Milarepa in the highest reverence and esteem, and they consider him the very prototype of everything that a great saint should be. In this way, then, Milarepa may be said to belong to no one sect or school. Milarepa, the Socrates of Asia, counted the world's intellectualisms, its prizes, and its pleasures as naught. His supreme quest was for that personal discovery of truth, which, as he teaches us, can be won only by introspection and self-analysis, through weighing life's values in the scale of the Bodhi illumined mind. In him, the teachings of all the great yogis of India, including the greatest of them known in history, Gautama the Buddha, when put to the test of scientific experimentation, failed not. How many parallels, too, may be drawn between Jetsun's precepts recorded in this biography and those of another great master of life will be seen by making comparison with the Sermon on the Mount. As a member of the Mongolian race, Milarepa, like Confucius, is but one more instance of the fact that genius recognizes no barriers in racial stock or nationality or creed, being as universally human as humanity itself. May this book help to spread understanding of this natural law of universal brotherhood. May it be one more humble memorial to its great hero. And may it go down to the generations yet unborn as a legacy from him who made possible its transmission to the European races, its learned translator, the late Lama Kazi Dawa-Samdup. The Tranquil, from the Buddha Dhammapada. Tranquil in body, speech, and mind, O mendicants, whoso in every way is well restrained, who all this world's desires hath thrown aside, he is tranquil. That mendicant with utter joy and gladness filled, firm in the teaching of the awakened one, reacheth the bliss where all conditions cease, reacheth the state of peace. I wish to narrate the history of a great yogi who lived in this high snow-clad tableland of Tibet. He was one who had been profoundly impressed from his early youth by the transient and impermanent nature of all conditions of worldly existence, and by the sufferings and wretchedness in which he saw all beings immersed. To him, existence seemed like some huge furnace wherein all living creatures were roasting. With such piercing sorrow did this fill his heart that he was unable to feel any envy even of the celestial felicity enjoyed by Brahma and Indra in their heavens, much less of the earthly joys and delights afforded by a life of worldly greatness. On the other hand, he was so captivated by the vision of immaculate purity, by the chaste beauty found in the description of the state of perfect freedom and omniscience associated with the attainment of nirvana, that he cared not even though he should lose his very life in the search of which he had set out. Endowed as he was with faith, firm and full, a keen intellect, and a heart overflowing with all-pervading love and sympathy. He was one who, having had the advantage of holy and sacred teachers, stored up the life-giving elixir that fell from their lips, and tasted it for himself in the delightful solitude of mountain retreats, thereby obtaining emancipation from the toils of ignorance, so that the seeds of experience and inspiration sprouted up in him and attained to full growth. He was one who, having thrown aside all concern for worldly prospects, ease, name, and fame, resolutely devoted himself to the single object of raising the banner of spiritual development to such a height that it might serve as a guide for future followers on the path, as a signal sufficient to save them from worldliness and to urge them onward and upward. He was one who, having been favored by gods and angels, triumphed over the difficulties of the path, obtaining transcendent preeminence in spiritual truths, and such depth of knowledge and experience therein that religious devotion became second nature to him. He was one who, by his profound reverence for and sincere belief in the Guru, obtained the grace and spiritual support and nomination as their adopted spiritual successor in the promulgation of spiritual truths, thereby manifesting supernormal powers and signs of an incomparable nature and unmistakable significance. He was one who, by the power of the greatness of his fervent, sincere, and altruistic love and compassion, was endowed with the power and gift of inspiring even unrighteous, worldly, sin-hardened, skeptical scoffers and unbelievers with involuntary emotion of soul-stirring faith, causing each hair on their body to stand on end in thrilling ecstasy, and making the tears to flow copiously from their eyes, thereby sowing in them the seed of future redemption and enlightenment, and causing it to sprout up in their heart by the mere hearing of his history and name. Thus he was enabled to reclaim, redeem, and protect them from the pains and terror of this low, worldly existence. He was one who, having mastered the mystic and occult sciences, had communicated to him the dakinis, the angels, continuously as the four blissful states of ecstatic communion, thus furthering his spiritual growth. He was one who eventually rid himself of the twofold shadow of illusion and karma, and soared into spiritual space till he attained the goal wherein all doctrines merge in at one point. He was one who, having attained to omniscience, all-pervading goodwill and glowing love, together with the acquisition of transcendental powers and virtues, became a self-developed Buddha, who towered above all conflicting opinions and arguments of the various sects and creeds, like the topmost gem that adorns the banner of victory. He was one who, having adopted the peerless Vajra path, gave himself to assiduous endeavor and attained the utmost height of spiritual experience and knowledge. He was one whose fame of surpassing merit, being hymned by gods and angels, hath filled all the 10 divisions of the universe with the waving of the banner of fame, and with the reverberating tones of the melody of praise. He was one whose physical body was pervaded by the descending bliss down to his very toes, and by the ascending bliss up to the crown of his head, were both merged in the moon fluid bliss, thence rebounding and coursing down the 3 principal nerves, uncoiling the coils of the nerve centers, and then finally enlarging the minutest nerves and changing them, all of them, into so many actual median nerves. He was one who thus was able to expound fluently the meanings and ideas contained in the 12 collection of sutras and the 4 scriptures, and to render them into metrical stanzas to be sung in the rites and rituals of the Vajra path. He was one who, having all his ideas and concepts merged with the primal cause, had eliminated the illusion of duality. He was one, being well versed in the science of mind and intellect, read external phenomena like a book. He was a being boundlessly endowed with grace, omniscience, power, and able to develop and emancipate even dumb beasts by preaching to them. He was a being who had passed beyond the need of observing worldly rules, artificial conventions, and flattery, reverentially worshipped by all rational beings, gods and men, with profound obeisance, while he remained tranquil, dignified, and attentive. He was a being most diligent in persevering in meditation upon the rare path, not excelled by, but rather excelling all other great yogis and bodhisattvas of his day, who were similarly blessed, becoming an object of worship even to them. With the deep thundering roar of a lion, he proclaimed the truth of the realizable fact of the illusoriness of the ego, and the full assurance of its realization, awing and subduing beings and creatures of evil and selfish disposition, and reveled in freedom in the limitless and centerless sphere of the heavens, like an unbridled lion roaming free among the mountain ranges. Having acquired full power over the mental states and faculties within, he overcame all dangers from the elements without and directed them to his own profit and use. Having obtained transcendental knowledge and the control of the ethereal and spiritual nature of the mind, he was enabled to furnish demonstration thereof by flying through the sky, by walking, resting, and sleeping, upheld by levitation in the air. Likewise, he was able to produce flames of fire and springs of water from his body, and to transform his body at will into any object desired, thereby convincing unbelievers and turning them towards religious pursuits. He was a being perfect in the practice of the 4 stages of meditation, and thus able to project his subtle body so as to be present at the presiding Yogi in all the 24 holy places where gods and angels assemble, like clouds for spiritual communion. Being fearless in the knowledge of the indestructible nature of mind, he was able to dominate gods and the elements of the 8 different kinds and make them carry out his commands instantaneously in the fulfillment of the 4 classes of duties. He was a master architect, well versed in the exposition of the science of the clear void of mind, wherein all forms and substances have their cause and origin. He was a deeply skilled physician, well practiced in the art of curing the chronic diseases of the unenlightened mind by applying the medicine of the 5 divine wisdoms. He was an accomplished interpreter of the good or evil significations of sounds inherent in all external and internal elements, while knowing each of them to be audible space. He was a well-grounded mathematician who had attuned his own mental state to the unchanging level of non-ego, while most clearly knowing all the inmost secrets and deepest recesses of the minds of others. He was a most learned professor in the science of the mind, having proved the mind to be beyond dispute the beginning and end of all visible phenomena, both material and spiritual, the rays whereof, being allowed to shine unobstructedly, develop themselves as he knew into the 3-fold manifestation of the universal divine being through their own free inherent power. Milarepa was a perfected adept in supernormal knowledge and powers, able to traverse and visit all the innumerable sacred paradises and heavens of the Buddhas, whereby the virtue of his all-absolving acts of unsurpassed devotion, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas presiding therein favored him with discourses on the Dharma and listened to his in return, so that he sanctified the heaven worlds themselves by his visits and sojourns there. Appearing to the creatures of the 6 lokas in suitable and specially adapted forms and guises, on various occasions in accordance with their karmic deserts, he taught them spiritual truths in a manner suited to the intellectual capacity and mood of his hearers, wrapping these truths in parables and metaphors which were in perfect accord with the wisdom of the victorious ones, thus by his teachings procuring their emancipation. In short, Milarepa was a being who within the space of one lifetime obtained the 4-fold personality and the 5-fold perfections, which constitute the omnipresent state of the great Vajradhara. Milarepa was one whose ceaseless grace and mercy were bestowed on the immeasurable countless multitude of sentient beings, for whose sake he continued setting the peerless wheel of truth in motion, thereby redeeming them from the unutterable anguish and woe of samsara. Milarepa was one who reached those dwelling in the city of the great emancipation, where every one existeth in indescribable bliss, at the same time obtaining and developing the 4-fold principle of immortality. Such was the great being who shone the brightest among all great beings, called the glorious Jetsun Milarepa Dorje, Milarepa, the illustrious, whose deeds and effulgence of whose name shone like the sun and moon themselves. albeit the intrinsic value of the supernormal services he rendered to those whom he met can neither be described nor limited. Yet I have attempted to set forth a brief eulogy of his various deeds. The history or biography will be divided into two parts. First, that dealing with his worldly career, and second, that dealing with his religious career, from its beginning right to the time when he attained nirvana. At the outset, I shall proceed to relate some particulars regarding his surname Mila and its origin, his ancestors, and the circumstances of his birth. Then I shall tell of the loss of his father during his childhood, which turned his relatives into enemies who robbed the orphans and the widow of their whole patrimony and plunged them into great sorrow, which served to impress the truth of the existence of sorrow indelibly upon Milarepa's heart. Then I shall tell of his studying the black art, so that he might be able to kill his enemies in compliance with his mother's command. Of these three things I shall now set forth somewhat at length the first, namely a few details concerning his birth and lineage.